not frequent examples occurring in our own times suffice to establish this fact, to the truth of which there is abundant testimony, end quote. So he's basically saying these things are true because we have so many examples of them. And he even notes that there are so many examples of such creatures in his own time that, and I quote, the undertaking would be beyond measure laborious and troublesome, end quote, for him to note them all down. So he restricts himself to the three that we're discussing here. But I do love the fact that he essentially goes, there's just far too many vampire stories, so they must be true. And it's like, nice one. Anyway, he does devote a lot more time to discussing the Melrose creature, and this particular revenant had been a priest, one who enjoyed quite a lot of material pleasures, and particularly hunting, so he gained the nickname of the Hunderprest. Now his former mistress, yes, you heard that right, started complaining to the priest's monastery that his spirit haunted her bedchamber, and he kept her awake all night with his noise, which sounds like you both rolling all night at her. 4 monks were assigned to help her by the church, and they took up a vigil beside the Hunderprest's grave. And I have to add that William does put in quite a slightly bitchy comment about how much she deserved their help, thanks to her frequent donations to their monastery. It's like, nice one, William. But when the Hunderprest didn't appear at midnight, 3 of the monks decided to seek warmth nearby, so surely the Hunderprest wouldn't appear now that the witching hour was over. And don't forget there is an episode on the witching hour already recorded. Now how wrong these monks were. Once they left, and there was only one of them left behind, the Hunderprest emerged from his grave, monstrous and enraged. Now he attacked the remaining monk, who thankfully stood firm, and actually drove his axe deep into the monster, and the monk even chased it right back into its grave. The other 3 monks finally returned, but the rest of the night passed without incident. At dawn, they decided to open the grave, but as their shovels dug into the soft clay, blood oozed up to meet them, and they were shocked to discover the corpse still looking as fresh as it had on the day that the priest was buried. There was also blood pouring from a gaping axe wound clearly inflicted the night before, so the monks carried the corpse away from the monastery and burned the remains to ashes, thus ending the reign of the Hunderprest. Now, according to William, he had heard the story of this particular revenant, and I quote, recounted by religious men, end quote, and apparently this means we just have to take his word for it. Now, William does lump the Melrose vampire and the Alnwick vampire together, although I should point out that there are 2 slightly different versions of the Alnwick vampire story. Now, and say they actually managed these transformations. Well, let's have a look at shape-shifting witches in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there, and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult, and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedwick, blogger, fantasy author, and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedwick. We are cracking on with Reader Request Month, and like I said last week, this is going to be the second in a 2-parter, because to be honest with you, the topic of shape-shifting, which was requested, is massive. So obviously we looked at fairies and other supernatural creatures last week, and this week we're going to look at magical shape-shifting, specifically how it relates to witches and witchcraft. And to be honest, it is a massive topic and there's a lot of scope, so we're not having a look at gods and goddesses or any of the magical transformations of those types, although like I say, I may do an episode on that in the future. I should point out, of course, that the focus is also going to be on Europe, but mostly the British Isles. But if you would like to know more about the shape-shifting abilities of witches in other parts of the world, then I would recommend that you check out The Witch by Ronald Hutton, and a link is in the show notes below. But we're just basically going to get cracking. Already had a magical reputation, or they might also think to see if the hair sighting matched any unusual events. And it was depending on these answers that the person would decide if they thought the report was true or not, which quite frankly I think demonstrates quite a high level of discernment. And I think this can sometimes be a bit of a problem that we have when we look at old records. We assume that people in earlier centuries were these really credulous people who just believed anything they were told, and clearly they weren't. It's just the way that I think sometimes they're portrayed by the people who did the collecting, who obviously, don't forget there's a class element there. But I like this idea that people might go, do you know what, you said that woman can turn into a hare, but last week you also said X, which wasn't true. And then of the dead to be a part of a magical practitioner's practice. And yes, it does appear in Homer's Odyssey when Odysseus heads to the underworld because he's essentially trying to get home on his Odyssey. and he's directed by the sorceress Kirka, and he uses a spell to speak to the spirits of the dead, and she directs him to make this drink for the ghosts and the spirits of the underworld, which involves the blood of an animal. I think it's sheep, and he's got to carry them out next to the entrance to the underworld, these necromantic rites of his. So he makes this drink out of blood, and I think he pours it into the pit, and all the ghosts come out of the underworld to drink it. And when they do that, Odysseus then gets them to tell him the future, and that's how he discovers how to get home. And this is very much divination by the dead, in the fact that you have knowledge that you want to gain, and you ask the dead for it. Unlike other forms of divination, where obviously you consult something else. And again, obviously there's a few episodes back where we look at things like tea leaves and so on. Obviously tea leaves a little bit less messy than animal blood. And interestingly, the Romans actually thought anyone who died violent or untimely deaths were especially powerful in necromancy. So we're going to skip forward from the ancient world to the medieval one. And there was obviously necromancy still being written about in the intervening time. And a lot of the medieval magic that you get in the European books comes from Arabic texts, and scholars would translate these into Latin in the 12th and early 13th centuries. And I think this is a point worth making, that a lot of what you see in occult books and so on does originally derive from these Arabic texts and so on. Alchemy would be another good example. And the word necromantia was sometimes used to actually translate the Arabic word for magic. Now, Sebastien Girault actually describes medieval necromancy as this whole big fusion of lots of different practices. So you've got the divination in there, you've got spells, astral magic, animal sacrifices, and sympathetic magic, and they're all combined into one to make this practice of necromancy, which does basically make it an amalgam of Greco-Roman paganism, Christian theology, some Jewish worship, and Arabic magic. So this is a really quite diverse practice in a lot of ways, and it should not be confused with witchcraft in any shape or form in this medieval period, because the fact that necromancy draws from all these different traditions and so on. And in the late 13th century, necromancy then became a label to lump together any rituals that related to spirits, and this was in contrast to natural magic, which the definitions seem to vary slightly, but it's essentially anything which could relate to the natural world, as you might imagine, and natural sciences and things like that, and so-called image magic, some of which involves the making of talismans and things like that. Now, these particular rituals that, as I say, come under the heading of necromancy were considered illicit, so because of that, the term necromancy then became associated with the conjuration of demons. Now, necromancy was basically bad, if we can use such a term, thanks to what Owen Davies calls, and I quote, the theological view that the raising of the dead was a divine miracle beyond human influence, end quote. And here, the spirits of the dead were then recast as demons, so you weren't consulting the spirits of the dead, you were actually consulting demons who were pretending to be the spirits of the dead. So all this being said, why would you actually take up necromancy? Now, practitioners apparently use demons to affect the will of others, to uncover knowledge, or to create illusions. And Sophie Page also adds that they use demons to, quote, move bodies to different locations very, very rapidly, end quote. And I don't know about you, but that does actually sound quite helpful. Now, handbooks actually explained ways to find treasure, attract beautiful women, and conjure illusions like massive armies and battles and things like that. So there's a lot to do with trying to find out things that you couldn't know otherwise, like, for example, finding treasure and so on. The attracting beautiful women one sort of falls under the auspices of being able to influence other people, and a lot of the books that I read about weren't quite sure how that really worked. But the bottom line is, they thought that they could solve crimes, they could predict the future, and find lost items. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who would absolutely love to see a medieval mystery television series where a necromancer poodles around the British Isles solving crimes with the help of the dead. Now, scholars did also perform angel magic, which obviously, as you can imagine, if necromancy is considered demonic, angel magic was the other end of the spectrum where you were then trying to contact angels. And the thing that I found really funny when I was reading about this is the fact that by summoning demons, necromancers showed, and I quote, a bold and flamboyant disaffection with social and religious norms, end quote. And Richard Kitehafer actually suggests that necromancy was basically a rebellious phase that reduced risk from a witch in the form of a toad. Now, Julian Goddard notes that cats were quite a common form for witches to shapeshift into, because unlike today, cats lived outside in the barn as working animals around the farm, so they were a little bit more feral than fully domesticated, and they lived on the boundary between kind of domestication and total wildness. And obviously even the unpredictability of cats made them really good candidates for demonic shapeshifters. Meanwhile, hares, which was another popular option, were prey animals rather than predators, but they were also unpredictable, fast and hard to catch, so being able to avoid your enemies was believed to be a useful skill for both witches and hares. And indeed, turning into a hare also allowed witches to race across the fields to attend sabbats or steal butter and milk from their neighbours. Now, in certain parts of Wales, Ireland, Scotland and Scandinavia, people believed that witches would turn into hares to suckle from cows and thus steal their neighbours' milk. Now, by the 19th and 20th centuries, most of the records of this belief actually comes from northern England, and in North Yorkshire, one witch named Nancy Newgill apparently transformed into a hedgehog to steal milk, and quite frankly, if you're wondering how that would even begin to work, given the height of a cow and the height of a hedgehog, then you're wondering the same thing as me. But witches thus transformed apparently also ate or damaged the agricultural produce of their neighbours, and I'm pretty sure you too can see the problem with thinking that the hare eating your cabbages is a witch in disguise. Now, occasionally people did think that witches could turn into dogs, birds or insects as well, and Goodare notes witches confessing to shapeshifting into whales so they could sink ships in Norwegian and Icelandic narratives. Now, elsewhere the witch might not shift their form, but the devil might, so various animals were also considered to be the devil in disguise as well. Owen Davies notes that the animals varied by location, so in Lincolnshire, witches might appear as ponies, dogs or bagpipes, and in Gwent they might be rats or greyhounds. Although witches weren't restricted to animals either, so much like the Headley cow and its ability to appear as inanimate objects that we encountered last week, one witch in Durham might take the form of a large sheet draped over a hedge. Again, how did anyone know? But this is indeed what appears in the records. And even as late as 1837, a young woman accused a witch of transforming into the Jack of Hearts after previously taking the form of a black cat. Now that's an incredibly specific image there, and obviously we don't quite know what was going on, but the fact that that one's a 19th century story does make you wonder exactly where these things came from. But of course the other thing that we start to get is this idea that if the witch is harmed in its animal form, that will then turn up on the human as well. And a 13th century report by Gervase of Tilbury actually noted that women had been wounded while in the form of cats and then turned up the next day with corresponding wounds while in human form. And something very similar pops up in the Jack tale related by Ed Karshner in our interview about Appalachian folklore. But by 1663, the belief that witches could shapeshift was so entrenched that confessions including shapeshifting were instantly considered to be true. Now, surprisingly, the belief in shapeshifting abilities of witches actually survived into the 20th century in the different parts of the British Isles. So exactly how do you go about shifting your form? Well, famed witch Isabel Gowdy provided a range of charms during her confession, and I do use that in inverted commas, in 1662. So according to legend, she'd met the devil twice, once on the road and once in Allen's Kirk, and to baptise her in his satanic ways, the devil sucked some of her blood out of a scratch on her shoulder, he spat this into his hand and then baptised her with it. And this then apparently gave her her various magical powers. So when she or other witches wanted to turn into a hare, the charm read, I shall gae until ein hare, with sorrow and sick and mickle care, and I shall gae in the devil's name, and quibble I come home again. To turn back into human form, they recited, Hare, hare, God send thee care, I am in a hare's likeness just now, but I shall be in a woman's likeness e'en now. So obviously the idea being that you're sort of saying, I'm currently a hare, but I will be in a woman's likeness now. It does appear, because with the format of these charms, that they did actually work fairly instantaneously, but witches apparently, according to Gowdy, could also turn into cats, and the charm for this one was, I shall gae into a cat, with sorrow and sick and a black shat, and I shall gae in the devil's name, and quill I come home again. And they could even turn into crows as well. I shall gae until a crow, with sorrow and sick and a black throw, and I shall gae in the devil's name, I quill I come home again. And all of these were actually reported in an 1890 issue of the Newcastle Courant. Now, if you do try any of these, then you do so at your own risk, although I would be fascinated to know if any of them actually worked. Now, one thing that I wanted to just draw attention to was the belief in shape-shifting witches, and Julian Goodhead does note that people didn't really believe folkloric narratives wholesale, in the way that I think sometimes we can think that they must have done. And he said that people assessed the tale based on what they actually knew. So, he gives the example of a person hearing a report that a woman in the village could turn into a hare. Now, the person hearing this wouldn't immediately dismiss this.